What happens when a seemingly simple crime turns into a national headline, spanning decades and challenging the very foundations of our justice system? Today, we dive into one of the most shocking cases that left investigators baffled and continues to raise questions about intellectual disability and the death penalty. Welcome to The Real Crime Diary, Daily Dose of Crime. I'm your host, MHB, and we're about to unravel a chilling case from Texas that will make you question everything you thought you knew about justice and morality. Picture a quiet neighborhood in Houston, Texas, in 1989. The kind of place where neighbors wave to each other and kids play on the street. But on one fateful day, this peaceful community was shattered by an unthinkable act of violence. Bonita Edwards, a 38-year-old widow, lived in an apartment with her twin 16-year-old daughters, Burnett and Annette. Their home, once a sanctuary, became the scene of a horrific crime that would haunt the city for years to come. On December 2nd, Bonita's concerned boyfriend made a grisly discovery. All three women had been brutally stabbed to death. The crime scene was shocking. A mother and her two teenage daughters, their lives cut tragically short in their own home. As news of the murders spread, fear gripped the community. Who could have committed such a heinous act? Despite an intensive investigation, leads were scarce. Neighbors had seen and heard nothing suspicious. There were no signs of forced entry, suggesting the killer might have been someone known to the family. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and months into years. The case of the Edwards family murders went cold, leaving a community in fear and a family without justice. For 6 long years, the killer walked free, while the memory of Bonita, Burnett, and Annette faded from headlines but never from the hearts of those who knew them. Little did anyone know, the truth behind this brutal crime was yet to be revealed, and when it finally came to light, it would shock everyone all over again. Garcia Glenn White, born in 1963, wasn't just any suspect. He was a man with a dark history that would send chills down anyone's spine. Before the Edwards family murders came to light, White had already left a trail of violence in his wake. In the autumn of 1989, White had a heated argument with a 27-year-old prostitute named Greta Williams at a crack house in Houston. The dispute turned deadly, and Williams lost her life. At the time, White managed to slip away unnoticed, the killing remaining unsolved. But White's violent tendencies didn't stop there. In July 1995, he struck again. This time, his target was a convenience store in Houston. Along with an accomplice, White attempted to rob the store, resulting in the death of the clerk, Hy Van Pham. It was during the investigation of this convenience store murder that White's involvement in the Edwards family murders came to light. In a twist of fate, White's own acquaintance, Tecumseh Manuel, revealed to investigators that White had confessed to the 1989 triple homicide. Cornered during interrogation for the convenience store killing, White initially denied any involvement in the Edwards case. But as the pressure mounted and portions of Manuel's interview were presented to him, White's facade crumbled. He finally admitted his responsibility for the gruesome murders that had haunted Houston for years. The investigation took a surprising turn when White initially spun a tale involving an accomplice named Terrence Moore. He claimed they had gone to Bonita's apartment together, intending to use drugs and have sex. According to this fabricated story, Moore was the one who stabbed Bonita and her daughters while White merely fondled one of the girls. However, this lie quickly unraveled when investigators discovered that Moore had died 4 months before the murders took place. Confronted with this fact, White crumbled and admitted he was solely responsible for the horrific crimes. The breakthrough in the case came when DNA and serology tests were conducted. These tests identified White's semen and blood samples at the crime scene, providing irrefutable evidence of his guilt. This scientific evidence was the final piece of the puzzle that investigators needed to close the case. In May 1996, nearly 7 years after the murders, a grand jury indicted White for the murders of Burnett and Annette Edwards. The inclusion of sexual assault charges made it a capital case. Just 2 months later, White faced trial. The evidence was overwhelming, and the jury found him guilty. Given the brutality of the crimes and the young age of 2 of the victims, White was sentenced to death. For nearly 3 decades, Garcia White has been fighting for his life through the legal system. His attorneys have left no stone unturned in their efforts to overturn his death sentence. One of the primary battlegrounds has been White's confession. His lawyers have argued that it shouldn't be admissible in court, claiming that investigators took advantage of White's intellectual limitations during the interrogation process. They've painted a picture of a vulnerable man, manipulated into incriminating himself without fully understanding his rights. Then there's the DNA evidence. White's defense team has raised questions about its reliability, pointing to the troubled history of the Houston Police Department's crime lab. They've suggested that inconsistencies in the testing could cast doubt on White's guilt. But perhaps the most compelling argument put forth by White's attorneys centers on his intellectual capacity. They've consistently maintained that White's low IQ and adaptive deficits should render him ineligible for the death penalty. They've presented evidence of his struggles with basic life skills, decision-making, and abstract thinking, arguing that executing someone with these limitations would be unconstitutional. Despite these persistent efforts, the courts have remained unmoved. Time and again, judges have rejected White's appeals, leaving him to face the ultimate punishment. It's a stark reminder of the uphill battle faced by death row inmates, even when questions of intellectual disability are at play. Fast forward to the present day, and Garcia White, now 60 years old, finds himself facing a grim reality. The state of Texas has set his execution date for October 1, 2024. This date looms large, not just for White, but for those following his case and the broader debate on capital punishment. If the execution proceeds as planned, White will become the fifth person put to death by Texas this year alone. This continues a troubling trend in the Lone Star State, where officials seem intent on carrying out death sentences for inmates who arrived on death row during the 1990s, a time when the death penalty was at its peak popularity among juries. It's worth noting that 4 out of the 5 executions in Texas this year have involved Black or Hispanic individuals, raising questions about racial disparities in the application of the death penalty. White's case adds another layer to this ongoing discussion. The execution of long-serving death row inmates like White also brings into focus the psychological toll of decades spent awaiting death. Some argue that such prolonged periods on death row constitute cruel and unusual punishment in themselves. The case of Garcia White brings to the forefront several ethical dilemmas surrounding capital punishment. One of the most pressing issues is the role of intellectual disability in death penalty cases. White's attorneys have consistently argued that his low IQ and cognitive deficits should make him ineligible for execution. This touches on a broader debate about whether individuals with intellectual disabilities can truly understand the nature of their crimes or the consequences of their actions. Another ethical consideration is the extraordinary length of time White has spent on death row, 28 years. This raises questions about the psychological impact of such prolonged confinement and whether it constitutes cruel and unusual punishment. Some argue that decades of living under the shadow of execution is a form of torture in itself. The case also reignites concerns about the reliability of confessions and forensic evidence in capital cases. White's initial confession was challenged on the grounds that his intellectual disability may have made him more susceptible to manipulation during interrogation. Similarly, the DNA evidence in his case came under scrutiny due to issues with the crime lab's practices. These factors combined paint a complex picture of the ethical landscape surrounding the death penalty. They force us to confront difficult questions about justice, mercy, and the limitations of our legal system. As society continues to grapple with these issues, cases like White's serve as a stark reminder of the high stakes involved in capital punishment. As Garcia White's execution date approaches, the debate surrounding his case continues to intensify. This complex and controversial case raises numerous questions about our justice system, the application of the death penalty, and the role of intellectual disability in capital punishment. What are your thoughts on this case? Do you believe justice is being served, or are there still unanswered questions? We'd love to hear your opinions in the comments section. Join us next time for another deep dive into true crime on The Real Crime Diary, where we'll continue to explore the most perplexing and thought-provoking cases in criminal history.